Put a clean 1998 sedan next to a brand new one off the lot. The new one stops faster, holds the road better, and protects you in a crash better than anything built 25 years ago. That part is not a debate. But here's the question almost nobody asks at the dealership. Which one is still running at 300,000 miles? Because surviving 250,000 miles is not about safety ratings. It is about which parts you can reach, which parts wear out on a schedule, and which ones fail without warning and take the whole car with them. So I pulled the 8 things that actually decide it. Some of them favor the old car. One of them, the last one, goes the other way, and it surprised me. Let me show you, part by part. Factor number 1 is repairability, and this is where old and new split the hardest. On an older car, the engine bay has room. You can put a wrench on the starter, the alternator, the water pump, without removing half the front of the car. A backyard mechanic can pull a starter in a driveway with hand tools in under an hour. The parts are everywhere. They are cheap, and 3 different aftermarket suppliers make the same one. That matters at 300,000 miles because by then you are not buying your first starter. You are buying your third. Now look at a new car. The engine bay is packed wall to wall. To reach a water pump, you might pull the timing cover. Some pumps are now driven off the timing chain and sit behind it, so a part that costs $40 turns into a job that costs $900 in labor. And a lot of newer modules will not even work until a dealer scan tool codes them to the car. You can bolt in the right part, and the car still throws a fault until somebody plugs in and runs the relearn. That is not a repair you finish in your driveway. So the old car wins factor 1, and it wins it cleanly. The car you can fix is the car that stays on the road. But repairability is only half the story, because the next factor is about a part that does not care how easy it is to reach. It is about whether it fails on a schedule or fails by surprise. Factor 2 is the timing system, and there is a myth here that costs people engines. The rule everyone repeats is simple. Timing belt, bad. Timing chain, lasts forever. A belt has to be replaced on a schedule, usually somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 miles, and if you skip it on an interference engine, the belt snaps, the valves hit the pistons, and you have a 4-figure repair from one cheap rubber part. So a chain sounds like the safe bet. No interval, no replacement, set it and forget it. Here is the exception nobody tells you. A chain is not a promise. A chain stretches. The tensioners and the plastic guides that hold it wear out. And on a number of modern engines, the chain is the weak point. It rattles on a cold start, it skips a tooth, and now the same timing failure that a belt would have given you shows up on the engine that was supposed to be maintenance-free. The difference is, you were watching the belt. Nobody was watching the chain. So which one survives to 300,000? The honest answer is, the one whose owner paid attention. An old car with a belt that gets replaced on time will outlive a new car with a stretched chain that everyone ignored because the manual never told them to look. The part is not the problem. The schedule the manual gives you is. And the next factor is the clearest example of that. A feature added for fuel economy that quietly shortens engine life. Factor 3 is how the engine breathes and how it gets fuel. And this is the biggest single change between an old car and a new one. The old engine is usually naturally aspirated with port fuel injection. The fuel sprays in behind the intake valve. That fuel constantly washes the back of the valve and keeps it clean. The engine is low stress. It makes its power without forcing air, and a 2-liter 4 that makes 140 horsepower is barely working. The new engine is small, turbocharged, and uses direct injection. The fuel is now sprayed straight into the cylinder, so it never touches the back of the intake valve anymore. And that one change creates a problem. Carbon and oil vapor from the crankcase bake onto the intake valves with nothing to wash them off. After 80 or 100,000 miles, you get carbon buildup thick enough to choke airflow, cause misfires, and rough idle. The fix is real, but it is not cheap. It is called walnut blasting. You pull the intake, and you blast crushed walnut shells across the valves to knock the carbon off. That is a real shop bill on a car that, on paper, asks for nothing. Add the turbo. A turbo spins on engine oil at temperatures that punish the oil. Run cheap oil or skip an oil change on a turbo direct injection engine and you cook it. The old naturally aspirated engine forgives a late oil change. The new turbo does not. More power from less engine sounds great until the bill arrives. And the next factor decides whether that engine can even be repaired when it does wear, what the block is made of. Factor 4 is the engine block itself, the big chunk of metal everything else bolts to. Older engines were very often cast iron. Iron is heavy, and that hurt fuel economy, which is exactly why the industry moved away from it. But iron is tough. It takes heat, it takes a rebuild, and the cylinder walls are part of the block, so a machine shop can bore it out oversize and put fresh pistons in. An iron block can be brought back from the dead more than once. The new engine is almost always aluminum. Aluminum is lighter and it sheds heat faster, and that is genuinely better for efficiency and warm-up. But aluminum does not tolerate overheating the way iron does. One bad overheat, a stuck thermostat, a failed water pump, a cracked plastic coolant fitting, and an aluminum head can warp or crack where an iron one would have shrugged it off. And many aluminum blocks do not have iron cylinder walls you can simply bore. They use a coating or a pressed-in liner, and when that wears, the repair is not a quick rebore. Sometimes it is a new block. So the conclusion is uncomfortable. The lighter, more efficient block is also the one with the lower margin for a single mistake. At 300,000 miles, you will have made a mistake somewhere. A cooling system part will fail. The iron engine forgives it. The aluminum one might not. And mistakes lead straight into the most expensive failure on any car, which is factor 5, the transmission. Factor 5 is the transmission, and this is the one that ends cars. Here is the paradox. The old 4-speed automatic is crude. It clunks, it shifts hard, and it wastes a little fuel doing it. By every modern measure, it is the worst transmission. And yet a well-maintained traditional hydraulic automatic, with the fluid actually changed, routinely crosses 200 and 300,000 miles. The new car often has a CVT, a continuously variable transmission that runs a steel belt or chain over 2 cone pulleys instead of fixed gears. It is smoother and it gets better fuel economy, which is exactly why it exists. But that belt and those pulleys live a hard life. The fluid breaks down under heat, and a lot of these are sold with a lifetime fluid label. And whose lifetime is that? Not the car's. People never change it because the manual told them not to, and the unit dies early. The dual clutch, the DCT, is the other one. It is basically a computer-controlled manual with 2 clutches, quick, efficient, and on some of them the clutches and the control unit wear out long before 300,000. So the resolution to the paradox is this. The cruder old automatic, kept full of fresh fluid, will usually outlast the clever new one. Not because it is better engineered, but because it was built to be serviced, and the new one was built to be sealed. And sealed is the whole theme of Factor 6, because the new car is full of parts that report to a computer. Factor 6 is the electronics. And this is where the phrase, computer on wheels, stops being a joke. Picture an old car's wiring, a handful of sensors, 1 engine computer, and a fuse box you can read. When something electrical goes wrong, there are only so many places it can be. You can chase it with a test light and a multimeter in your driveway. Now picture a new car. Dozens of control modules, 1 for the engine, 1 for the transmission, 1 for the body, 1 for the doors, 1 for the steering, 1 for the parking sensors. All talking to each other over a single data network called the CAN bus. Every module is a part that can fail. Every connector is a place corrosion can get in. And when one module drops off the network, the car can throw 10 warning lights that have nothing to do with the real problem. That is the ghost code people complain about. The car says everything is broken because one cheap sensor went quiet. And here is the part that hits at high mileage. These modules are not always available forever. A 20-year-old electronic module can be discontinued, and a perfectly good car gets parked over a part nobody makes anymore. The old car rusts before its electronics quit. The new car can have its electronics quit while the body is still perfect. And speaking of the body, Factor 7 is the one that decides whether the shell around the engine even lasts long enough to matter. Factor 7 is rust. And this one actually flips the script, so stay with me. Picture two cars in a salt belt winter. The old car from the 80s or 90s came out of the factory with thin, single-sided galvanizing and not much underbody coating. Park it where they salt the roads and the rocker panels bubble, the subframe scales over, and the brake lines rust from the inside. People love an old, simple car, but plenty of them did not die from a blown engine. They died from a subframe you could put a screwdriver through. Now the new car. Manufacturers learned. Modern bodies use two-sided galvanized steel, better seam sealer, wax injected into the cavities, and aluminum or coated panels in the worst spots. A new car simply resists rust better than an old one did at the same age. So here is the payoff, and it is the honest one. On rust alone, the new car wins. The engine in your old car might be willing to run to 400,000, but if the subframe rots out at 200, the engine never gets the chance. A car is only as alive as the shell holding it together. So we have 7 factors, and the score is split. And that sets up the last one, the factor that ties it all together and decides who actually wins the money fight. Factor 8 is the one I held for last, because it is the most counterintuitive, and it is the one that actually saves you the most money. The question is simple. Over 300,000 miles, which car costs you less to own? Everything I have said so far points at the old car. Easier to fix, tougher block, simpler transmission, fewer modules. So the answer should be obvious. And it almost is. But here is where it turns. The real number that decides everything is not the price of any single part. It is mileage per repair. How far the car goes between bills, multiplied by what each bill costs. The old car wins on cost per repair. A starter is cheap, a water pump is cheap, you do the labor yourself. But the old car loses on the things that never show up on a parts receipt. It burns more fuel, sometimes a third more for the same trip. Over 300,000 miles, that fuel gap alone can run into the thousands of dollars. The new car costs more when something breaks, but it breaks less often, in the first 100,000. It sips less fuel the whole way, and it does not strand you on the side of the road as much getting there. So here is the real answer, and it is not a clean win for either side. If you can turn your own wrenches, an old simple car driven to 300,000 is the cheapest transportation on earth. Nothing beats a paid-off car you fix yourself in your own driveway. But if you cannot do the work, if every repair means paying a shop, the math quietly tips. The old car's cheap parts plus expensive shop labor plus a thirsty engine can cost you more than a newer car that just needs fluids and tires for its first stretch. The deciding factor was never the metal. It was whether the person holding the wrench is you or a stranger with an invoice. So let me bring the 8 factors together. The old car wins repairability, the engine block, the transmission, and the electronics. It is simpler, tougher, and you can keep it alive yourself. The new car wins rust protection, fuel economy, and the early years where it just runs without bills. And the very last factor, total cost to 300,000 miles, comes down to one thing: whether you do your own work. A simple car you maintain yourself will outlive a complex car nobody services. That is the real verdict, and it has nothing to do with the year on the title. Now I want yours. What is the highest mileage car you have personally driven? What year and make was it? And was it the engine or the rust that finally killed it? Drop the number in the comments, I read them. And if you are keeping a high mileage car alive, subscribe, because that is the whole point of this channel.